What is the most mind-boggling coincidence you've ever experienced? I was hanging out with my cousin, probably around 16 at the time. He's 10 years older than me and was introducing me to all kinds of cool stuff I should know about. This was back when broadband didn't exist where we lived and VHS tapes were still the norm. We had probably been smoking pot the night before and watching a Twin Peaks marathon or something along those lines. It was winter. A Sunday night. No idea what time, just very dark. He was driving me home and we were listening to the Twin Peaks soundtrack. On the way, he started telling me about a time he'd been really stoned with his friends, and one of them had done something genuinely freaky involving a dog puppet to a particular song, The Black Dog Runs at Night. I'm pretty sure he then played the song, which already had me a little on edge because it's creepy as hell. A few more miles passed, and we turned off the main road toward my driveway. And there, standing right in the middle of it, was a black dog, about the size of a lab. We did not own a dog. None of our neighbors owned a black dog. We lived in a fairly rural area. I immediately said, "Drive me around to the basement entrance." I had my house key in hand and sprinted to the door. I was legitimately freaked out. It turned out the dog was actually very nice, and it looked a lot cuter in daylight. I started calling it Agent Cooper. After a few days of calling neighbors to see if it belonged to anyone and leaving it food and water, we eventually had to call the pound to pick it up. I still have no idea where it came from. Story 2. My mom once had a dream that her dad was at work and fell, breaking his leg. The next morning, she called him to ask if he would be working that day, Saturday, though he often went in on weekends since he owned the company. She told him about her dream and warned him to be careful. He laughed and said he would try. Later that night, we got a call from our grandma asking if we had heard from him. We hadn't, so we contacted an employee who lived near the plant to check on him. The employee found him unconscious in a pool of blood. Over the next 24 hours, we learned that a worker, high on crack, had robbed him and struck him on the head with a hammer at least 7 times. He survived barely long enough to be taken to the hospital, but tragically died at 7 a.m. the next morning. Fast forward about 5 years. My mom had another dream. She was walking in a grassy field with her grandma, her deceased father's mother. They reached a grassy hill, and at the top, my mom saw her dad. Excited, they hugged and talked. He asked how she and the family were and told her he was proud of her. Then he took the walker my great-grandmother had used, set it aside, took her by the arm, and walked with her up the hill. The next day, my mom called the retirement home where my great-grandmother lived to speak to her, only to learn that she had passed away in her sleep the night before. Story 3. My cousin died when I was 18, right before I went to college. One night, while chatting online with a girl who also knew my cousin, she sent me a link to a website. It was some Make-A-Wish site full of cheesy gifs and silly space sound effects. I decided to try it for fun. I wished to go back in time and visit my cousin, because if I get one wish, I'm not wasting it on something that's already possible or requires advanced technology that doesn't exist yet. The site then started talking about the power of 8. How 8 is magical and will grant my wish. It instructed me to write the number 8 on a piece of paper and hold it under the moonlight every day for 8 days, and so on. I thought it would look really weird if my roommate saw me doing this, so I just clicked Stumble, which takes you to a completely random page on the internet. It brought me to a YouTube video with 888 ratings. The video was about string theory and the possibilities of time travel. Needless to say, I did not hold up a piece of paper with an 8 written on it for 8 nights in a row. Story 4. I had tried to get this girl to date me for about a year, but it never happened. Eventually, we went our separate ways and I didn't talk to her for a couple of years. Fast forward to 2005, and I'm traveling around Japan for the summer. A few days after I arrive, I'm wandering around Sensoji Temple during one of the busiest festivals, Sanja Matsuri, when I suddenly hear my name being called through the crowd. I have a really common name and don't know anyone there, so I figure it's just some tourists calling after their kid. I don't even bother looking up. A minute or two later, I hear it again, but closer this time. I look up, and it's her. Halfway across the world, we had both ended up not only in Japan, but at the same temple, at the same festival, on the same day. We start talking, and I'm laying it on thick, joking about how this must be a sign we should hook up, when a German guy walks up and she introduces him as her fiancé. Sucks. Story 5. I have had a couple of experiences that really hammered home how small the world is and how the idea of 6 degrees of separation is probably an even smaller number. The first was during summer vacation from college in San Diego, when I went to Tehran to visit family and do some sightseeing. While walking through a random food court in a mall, I bumped into one of my classmates from college, 7,500 miles away, in a metro area of about 13 million people. A couple of years later, while working as an ESL teacher in a backwater town in South Korea, a random girl on a train struck up a conversation with me. You know how sometimes at a party, someone will ask a foreigner something like, "Oh, you're from Guatemala. Do you know so-and-so?" And it sounds ridiculous? She did exactly that. "Oh, you're from California. Do you know her?" It turned out to be someone I had dated 6 years earlier. Those two events really changed how I look at strangers on the street. It is not just possible, but likely, that you are only a couple of chance encounters away from anyone on the planet, so treat everyone like you might run into them at your next work party. Story 6. I have two really crazy ones, both from my volunteering trips to Peru and Honduras. Peru. The summer before my senior year of high school, I volunteered at an orphanage in Cusco. The first 2 weeks, the volunteers traveled around the country visiting various sites. We were in this one remote village, at least 3 hours from the nearest city, during a massive celebration of the saints, basically a non-stop 3-day, 3-night party in the streets. A random guy hears us speaking English, asks if we are American, and we start talking. We sit down for a couple of beers, and he asks where I'm from. I say New Jersey. He goes, "My cousins live in New Jersey. They go to Bridgewater Raritan High School." I nearly lost it. That's exactly where I went to high school, Honduras. The summer before my sophomore year of college, I went to La Esperanza, Honduras, to help build houses. I got close with the other volunteers, who were from all over the world. Despite people coming and going, we had a solid core group. About a year later, I saw that my fellow volunteer Kathy had been tagged in the same Facebook album as my friend Joyce from school. I clicked on the link and discovered that not only were they in the same photo, they were close friends. They had apparently worked at the same camp in Panama City. Bonus. My cousin, born and raised in San Francisco, recently started college in New York. She ended up becoming best friends with the girlfriend of a kid I had known for about 7 years from karate school in New Jersey. Story 7. When I first met my wife, we discovered we both had the same ATM card and voicemail PIN, oddly enough, both originally chosen by our mothers and then adopted by us for convenience. I'm from Ireland, and while traveling in Australia, I got injured at Ayers Rock and had to head back to Alice Springs for the hospital. While chatting with the doctor there, she mentioned how many non-Australians work in Alice Springs. She pointed out that 2 of the barmen at the pub near where I was staying were Irish. That evening, I went to the pub and realized that one of the barmen was a guy I had lived with in college for a few years. We had been good friends but had drifted apart. He had planned to leave the day before I arrived but decided to stay another week to make a little extra money. I had never been on a plane until I was 23, but within 2 years I had taken about 19 or 20 flights. My 13th flight happened on a Friday the 13th at 1:17 p.m. I'm not usually superstitious, but I was a nervous wreck for that one, and I'm generally not the best air passenger to begin with. Story 8. My family was driving along a freeway on a cross-country trip. My mom was driving, and I was in the front passenger seat. My dad and brother were in the back. My dad was sleeping, as my parents were taking shifts, driving, and my brother, who hates wearing seatbelts, wasn't buckled in. Out of nowhere, my dad wakes up, no outside stimulus, just randomly, and says, "Put on your seatbelt," then goes back to sleep. My brother quickly buckles up. About 10 minutes later, we got into the worst car crash we've ever experienced. The car flipped 4 or 5 times before finally coming to rest upside down on the grass divider between the 2 sides of the freeway. My brother would probably have died that day if he hadn't listened. Story 9. I woke up one morning and, for no reason, realized that my dermatologist, whom I hadn't seen in more than a year, goodbye puberty, was actually the assistant of another dermatologist I'd been to a couple of times about 3 years earlier. That in itself is so random and weird, because I had absolutely no reason to be thinking about her, and I could have and probably should have made the connection back then. A few hours later, while we were having lunch, my mother goes, "Hey, you know what I realized?" And yep, the exact same thing. I genuinely thought she was messing with me. What was even more frustrating, though, was that her only reaction to the coincidence was, "Meh, no wonder I sip an atheist." Story 10. I was vacationing in Clearwater, Florida with my parents when I was around 14, and we're from the Northeast, near Philly, about 1,100 miles away. One night we went mini-golfing and literally bumped into a friend of mine from my traveling soccer team. Our parents knew each other pretty well, but not well enough to be sharing vacation plans. We all laughed at the coincidence and decided to go out to eat together the next night. When we met at the restaurant, we were talking about how funny it was that we'd run into each other so far from home. The couple at the table next to us overheard, and since the whole vibe was friendly, we shared the story with them too. They thought it was great and asked where we were from. We told them the town, and they went, "Do you know Fred Johnson? My parents' neighbor and best friend, and apparently also a close friend of theirs." Turns out the couple sitting next to us was Fred Johnson's brother. Story 11. When I was around 10 or 11, my family would drive from Cincinnati to visit my aunt in Pennsylvania every summer. We never left on the same date each year. There was no set schedule. One year, after crossing into Pennsylvania but still a good distance from Philly, we stopped at a rest area to use the bathroom and grab some food. I finished up and was walking back to the car when I heard someone yell my name. It didn't sound like either of my parents, so I ignored it, assuming they were calling someone else with the same name. Then I heard it again. I turned around, and it was my neighbor, my age, walking toward me. He lived a couple of houses down from me back home. We hung out occasionally but weren't especially close. He told me his family was also on a road trip to Pennsylvania to visit relatives. That alone was strange enough, hundreds of miles from home, stopping at the same rest stop at the exact same time. But it got weirder. We eventually arrived at my aunt's house in Doylestown. A few hours later, we were sitting outside on the porch, adults drinking wine, kids playing, when I saw a familiar car pull up on the street. It was his family. It turned out he was visiting his aunt, who lived just a couple of doors down from mine. Still the coolest coincidence of my life. Story 12. When I first got to college, I tried out Zonga because a bunch of friends were using it. I joined a bunch of rings, checked out featured Zongans, the whole thing. Then I got a really intelligent comment from some guy, and when I found out he was Vietnamese, we kept talking. Trust me, an intelligent, literature-obsessed Asian blogger was pretty rare at the time. After a while, we realized our dads actually knew each other from way back in Vietnam. His older aunt, in fact, is one of my dad's best friends. Our dads had left their hometowns at different times and ended up in different cities in the US, but somehow their firstborn kids in America found each other on a blogging site. Story 13. Another one, my grandfather owned a farm in the early to mid-1900s, and his pride and joy was a 1930s Farmall tractor. They gave up the farm and moved to a home down the road when my mother was born in the 1960s. But the tractor stayed in an old barn until the 1980s. The person who bought my grandfather's farm was a family friend, and he thought it would be nice to restore the old Farmall. He worked on it off and on for more than 20 years, but he could never get it to start. Fast forward to 2005. My grandfather passed away at 95 years old. 1 hour after he died, the family friend called the house to tell him that he had finally gotten the Farmall running and had been doing laps around the field for the past hour and a half. Even though he tried, the tractor never started again. And last year, while my grandfather's friend was away on vacation, some assholes broke into the barn and gutted it for parts. Story 14. I had a friend who has since passed away, and the circumstances of his death have always confounded me. We met during our internship and became close friends. Nearly every day after work, I would head over to his place where he, his two housemates, and I would hang out. We drank some beers, played Xbox, watched movies, and talked nonsense, without fail every single day throughout the entire summer. During that time, I had a bad habit of putting off my laundry until I absolutely had to do it. I hated dragging my clothes down to the coin-op, so I always saved it for the weekends. I never did it on weekdays because I was already exhausted from work. One day, though, I decided to switch it up and do my laundry right after work. The plan was to show up at my friend's place a few hours later than usual. One of his roommates had left town to try to sort things out with his girlfriend, so it was going to be a smaller group. When I arrived, there were police officers standing outside the house. The paramedics had just taken my friend away. Apparently, he had been relaxing on the couch in the living room, and his roommate came out of the shower to find him unconscious. He was pronounced dead at the hospital. We later learned it was a freak aneurysm. So that is how my buddy went. The very moment he passed away, it was the one time I decided to do my laundry on a weekday instead of being there with him. One housemate had left town at a minute's notice, and the other was in the shower in the room immediately next to him. In retrospect, there really was nothing that could have been done, even if one of us had been there. Still, it is chilling to know that he was completely alone when it happened. Needless to say, the experience completely changed how I view life. I learned that you can be gone at a moment's notice with absolutely no control over how it happens. It shattered my teenage I'm invincible mindset. Story 15. When I was in college, a friend was talking to his girlfriend on the phone. She had to step away to do something, so she handed the phone to a random girl in the lounge. He did not want to talk to her, so he passed the phone to me instead. I chatted with her for a while, and then his girlfriend came back, so I handed the phone back. About a year later, I went with him to a dance at his girlfriend's college. I met a girl there, dated her, and eventually married her. 3 years later, we realized that she and I had talked on the phone a year before we ever met. There were 2 more strange phone-related coincidences. While I was stationed at the embassy in Cairo, I spoke with the weapons officer aboard a guided missile cruiser in the Mediterranean. We discovered he had been sitting next to me at graduation 5 years earlier. I also once spoke with a Coast Guard officer assigned to a detachment in Hurghada. 5 years later, we ended up with adjacent mail slots in law school. Story 16. The first time I hitchhiked, I went from Little Rock, Arkansas to Orlando, Florida. I was supposed to stay with friends when I got there, but their phone was shut off while I was en route. I was stuck. I had no idea what I was doing, no cash, no one to call, and things were looking pretty grim. I was sitting on a bench, defeated, sunburned to a literal crisp, head down, just hoping for some kind of miracle. Then, this big, boisterous redneck guy walked up to me and said, "Boy, you look about beat." I looked up and said, "Well, yeah." He was drunk and still drinking, having just been kicked out of his 3rd bar of the day, and it was only 4 p.m. He asked what my deal was, and I gave him the skinny. It turned out he was also from Arkansas and had an ex-girlfriend who lived in my town, down the street from my house even. He described my own house to me. I took it as a sign and accepted a ride out of town, since he was heading west the next day. We ended up going to Daytona that night just to party and have a good time. He got us a hotel room, bought a couple cases of beer, and even snuck me into a club. I was 16. The next morning we took off, and he got me about half the way back to Little Rock. Story 17. I believe it was the summer before my freshman year of high school when my best friend tried to off himself by OD. She was already in the hospital, and I had no idea what was happening. That night, I received a random text that said, "Who is this?" from a number I did not recognize. I replied, "This is insert name here. Who is this?" The number then called me, and it turned out to be my best friend's mother. Jenna asked why I had sent her a picture of a cat. I told her that could not have been me. I did not even have picture messaging. She insisted it had come from my number. I said I had no idea. That was when Jenna told me that insert best friend's name here was in the hospital for a drug overdose, and that I needed to get there immediately. If Jenna had not received that random picture of a cat, there is no telling how much later I would have found out that my best friend had just tried to off herself. Story 18. Once, I was hitchhiking through El Paso, Texas. I had been dropped off at one end of town and walked about 5 miles into the middle of that nasty freeway interchange they have down there. It was dirty and bleak, the sweaty armpit of the nation, especially when you are walking in the sun. This was the early 1990s, and everything felt industrial and grimy back then. I had been walking for quite a while. I used to hitchhike all over, so I was usually optimistic, but no one stopped. I kept walking, and by about 2 p.m. it was hot. As one car went by, I turned my thumb into a finger gun and shot at the rear tire. The tire blew out just as I pulled my imaginary trigger. Those jerks changed the tire about 50 yards past me and did not offer me a ride. I do not pull the Maxwell Smart on anyone anymore. Story 19. I live in New York City and needed to visit my grandparents in New Jersey, which is a short NJ Transit train ride from Penn Station. It was my turn to step up to one of the ticket machines, and I was hoping to do it quickly because I really needed to use the bathroom. I thought I was hiding it well, but a homeless guy standing near the machine suddenly yelled, "Hey buddy, bathrooms are to the right. Bathrooms are to the right." I smiled and said thanks. As I reached out to touch the screen of the electronic kiosk, he said, "South Orange is 524, man, 524. That was the exact ticket number I needed to buy. I had given no indication of where I was going, and the train's departure was still a good 30 minutes away. I was not talking on the phone or saying anything out loud. I had just been silently waiting in line. What made it stranger was the look on his face when he said it. Sure, a homeless guy guessing I needed the bathroom was not that unusual and was probably a well-used tactic, but knowing my destination felt different. For a moment, I wondered if there was some kind of connection, so I tried thinking of something specific to see if there would be a response. There was not. He broke his stare, wandered off immediately afterward, and that was it. It just felt strange to have those two things happen back to back. Maybe it was not a coincidence. Story 20. This one is less significant than some of the others, but still strange. I was once at a friend's house just hanging out, playing video games, and relaxing. At one point, no one had said a word for about 20 minutes. My friend's brother was in the room watching us play, and he had not said anything either. Then, at the exact same time, we both said, almost in unison, "Where a kid can be a kid," which was the Chuck E. Cheese catchphrase at the time. We looked at each other and immediately started cracking up at how random it was. Neither of us had ever been to Chuck E. Cheese, and neither of us had seen a commercial with that tagline in at least 6 months. Story 22. So, my brother was in China for a semester, and I decided to take 3 weeks to go visit him. He lived in the American part of town, so we saw a lot of white people near his apartment, but aside from that, it was all Asia all the time. Of course, there were other students there on semester abroad programs. One of his classmates and I were going to run an errand before meeting my brother for dinner. We took the subway to a different university that rarely takes foreign students, though occasionally foreigners work there, her being one of them. She went to get supplies at her office while I walked off campus to look for some street food. I didn't see much I liked, mostly random shops, but there was this place that sold yogurt drinks, a whole store dedicated to liquid yogurt. Weird, but I was intrigued. I got a drink and sat at a table. The place was empty. Not long after, a group of Chinese guys walked in, looking for a table. As they passed, I noticed that the guy closest to me had the same body shape and haircut as someone I remembered from high school 7 years ago. He was the only Asian kid at my school, and a bit portly. Then, he turned around, and it was him. I hadn't seen him in 7 years, but he looked the same. I said, "Dave?" And he said, "Yeah?" Our minds were blown. We talked for a bit. He was on his way back to the US after living in Beijing for 3 years, and had also been drawn to this yogurt place for the novelty of it. We ended up hanging out and even went to a concert with some other people. It was altogether a really weird, surreal encounter. Story 23. This didn't happen to me, but to my stepfather. For a while, my mom and stepdad had been trying to buy a house, but they couldn't find a bank willing to give them a mortgage. The bank said my stepdad's credit was too bad, which baffled them since he always paid his bills on time and had no real debt. Around the time of my stepdad's U.S. citizenship ceremony, my parents went to the Social Security office to get everything squared away. On a whim, my mom asked about my stepdad's supposed debt problems. When the worker looked into it, he said there was about $300,000 in debt under my stepdad's name in Florida, at a residence he had never lived at. The only time he had ever even been to Florida was a family trip to Disney World. The Social Security worker investigated, and over the next few days, phone calls were made. It turned out there was another man in Florida with this massive debt, but he had been issued my stepdad's Social Security number. How did this happen? The two men had the same date of birth, place of birth, first name, middle initial, last name, and mother's maiden name. The government had mistakenly given my stepfather's Social Security number to someone else. Story 24. I'm in college now. I was scrolling through Facebook pictures of a girl I knew in high school who was a few years older than me. After looking through a few photos, I was shocked to see my best friend's older sister in a picture with her. Eventually, I learned that they are now roommates in college. Weird coincidence, but nothing too crazy. Just a small world, eh? Kind of thing. Then, after looking at a few pictures of them at a party, I was even more shocked to see a girl from my lab class in a photo with the two girls I already knew. Apparently, it really is a very small world. Story 25. I went to college in Arizona, but I'm originally from Spain. My college roommate worked at a Super 8, and one day some tourists came through who were from Spain. He didn't understand what they were saying, so he called me. I went to the motel to help translate. It was a husband, wife, and 2 daughters, and it turned out we were practically neighbors back in Spain. They lived about 2 miles from where I grew up. Fast forward 6 years. I'm running a tour of Spain for U.S. high school students, still living in the U.S. At the Madrid airport, I'm picking up students when a girl, really attractive, asks me for the time. We start talking, and it turns out she's one of the sisters from the Super 8 encounter. On the same day, about 20 feet from that encounter, I ran into another girl I had a crush on and hadn't spoken to in 2 years. This was pre-Facebook times. Story 26. I was seeing someone from work, friends with benefits. We had our ups and downs, and she knew I liked to occasionally have fun elsewhere, just as she did. I had been writing ads on the NSA section of Craigslist for months, mostly getting duds, but this time I decided to put in some real effort and make it sexy and erotic. Lo and behold, the first and only response I received was from my FWB. There was no way she could have identified me. The NSA section probably gets 500 posts a day. I had to triple check the email headers to make sure it was who I thought it was, as the Craigslist email was sitting right next to other emails from her. I considered trolling her from another account and leading her on, but the coincidence was too strong, so I just let her know what had happened. Still, my FWB. 5 years later. A www. Story 27. Last year, I went skiing with some of my family. Since I am not a very good skier, I spent most of the day on the smaller slopes by myself. The place we went was about 4 hours from my house, and it was packed that day. At one point, I found myself thinking about a guy I had had a crush on for a while, and how he seemed like the type who would be a snowboarder if he were there. As I skied back down toward the lodge, I decided to stop and turned around. At the top of a small hill, there was a guy on a snowboard. I literally did a double take. It was him, exactly as I had imagined. I went over and said hello. It turned out he had never snowboarded before and was terrible at it. We ended up spending the rest of the time skiing and snowboarding together. Well, mostly him rolling down hills. Needless to say, I was pretty convinced I had summoned the magical gods of coincidence to connect me with my crush, hours from home, in a crowded place, on that very day. Story 28. I served in the Peace Corps on a tiny island in the Caribbean, where no more than a dozen volunteers were there at a time. One tragic day, I was attacked by fire ants, went into anaphylactic shock, and was eventually medevaced to Washington, D.C. for a month and a half of testing. One afternoon, after some boring meetings with my medical officer, I decided to grab a sandwich at Potbelly's. While I was waiting in line, a blonde woman walked in and started staring at me. She looked very surprised, her eyes wide, and then said, "Excuse me, is your name blank?" I replied, yeah. She explained that she recognized me from another volunteer's Facebook pictures. It turned out she had been a volunteer on the very same island just before I arrived. Story 29. When I was about 18, I worked as a data entry clerk. We entered information from things like applications people mailed in to redeem cereal box points, as well as data from scanned ID and license cards. I had only been there about a week and did not have any connections or friends in high places. One day, I was assigned to enter data from a license belonging to a guy whose name was eerily similar to mine. His first name was exactly my full name combined. For example, if my name were Eric Hent, his name would have been Eric Hent, whatever. I do not have a common name at all, and my first and last name mashed together as a single first name would make absolutely no sense. To this day, it still freaks me out. Out of all the people in the world whose ID could have been scanned, and all the people doing data entry, we somehow crossed paths. Story 30. This happened last year when I was attending an arts boarding high school. I was one of 2 jazz pianists at the school and had a good relationship with Ben, the other pianist. One morning, he told me he may have accidentally been sent an email that mentioned my hometown, La Cañada, California. Mind you, he is from Seattle, and the school is in Michigan, so I figured he had gotten some names mixed up. He forwarded the email to me that day, and as I read it, the sender mentioned one of the main streets in my town and how his 4 sons basically spent their weekends there growing up. When I reached the bottom of the letter, I was shocked to see that it was signed by my next-door neighbor. I called the youngest of the 4 brothers, Troy, and told him his dad should resend that email. Story 31. I have been very close friends with a girl for a couple of years. We lived together in the same house for a year and still regularly hang out, talk, and know a lot about each other's families. One day this year, we were out walking and somehow got onto the topic of what our grandparents did. It turned out her grandfather had been stationed in West Germany in the 1960s, serving with NATO in the military or Air Force. That immediately caught my attention because my own grandfather had also been in West Germany in the 1960s, serving with NATO as a military engineer. The strangest part was that neither grandfather was German. Hers was English and mine was Iranian, and now we both live in Canada. Story 32. I have 2. Short one. I was playing Halo online in college, got a ridiculously awesome kill, and instantly heard someone in my hall yell, "BS." Turns out a random dude in my hall was on the other team. Long one. I used to read a lot, but mostly short books, around 100 pages. One day, my mom randomly got me a long book to read, a Redwall book, Matameo, as I recall. Fast forward about a year, and I was at a retreat for my children's choir, which my mom ran. She forgot to bunk me with my friend in the choir, so I ended up with a random bunkmate. He also loved Redwall, and we hit it off. It turned out he was part of a Redwall roleplay fan site online. I joined too, eventually got bored, but stayed in contact with one girl from another site I had started visiting. As it turns out, this girl lived in Florida, was on my cousin's swim team, and my aunt was her mom's regular nurse for cancer treatment. If I had ever gone with my cousin to his swim meets when visiting there, I would have met her. It really weirded me out. Story 33. While I was in college, I worked at the grocery store around the corner from my house. Our neighbor, 2 doors down, was the cousin of my brother's best friend, so I ran into her often when she came in. One night, I had a very vivid dream that my brother's friend came over to tell us he had gotten engaged. For some reason, the number 24 was very significant in the dream, like they were planning to get married on the 24th or there would be 24 people in the wedding party. A few days later, the cousin stopped by the store, and while we were chatting, she mentioned that my brother's friend had gotten engaged. I told her about the dream, and we had a good laugh at the coincidence. When I got home that night, I told my mother, and we laughed too. A few days after that, the friend came by our house to make the official engagement announcement. After telling us how he proposed, I asked when it happened. He replied, Saturday. I looked at the calendar, and sure enough, Saturday was the 24th. Story 34. This isn't exactly a coincidence story, but it's one of my favorite stoner stories. In university, I worked at a stemware store, wine glasses, teapots, etc., called Liquid. I didn't have a cell phone, so my buddies would call me at the shop if they wanted to meet up after work. One day, I met up with a friend. We rolled one up, started giggling, and he told me how funny the store's answering machine was. Naturally, we dialed it to listen. You have reached the voicemail box of Liquid. Ha ha ha, indeed. It was hilarious. We lost it laughing. Being baked and mischievous, we called it again and again and again. Eventually, we got tired, and the conversation drifted to my boss, a 33-year-old chubby guy with a receding hairline, though I did mention some redeeming qualities. In the middle of my tirade, the phone said, "If you are finished with your message, please press 1 or hang up now." We looked at each other. Oh shit. My friend grabbed the phone and beep, hung it up. Then memory kicked in. Oh shit. To erase this message, please press 2. Panic set in. We should have pressed 2. Not hung up. I had a key to the store but didn't set to know the phone SEP's password. No luck. I had to face the music. The next day, I went into work ready to confess, explain that I was baked, and beg for forgiveness. I said, "Hey Ned." Ned replied, "Hey Biz, I gotta run. But just so you know, the phone guy is coming in to replace it. If you need it, the password is 2343. Story 35. A few years ago, I was at a PGA Tour event, the Memorial, spectating on the 8th green. It was a par 3, and Jeff Maggart was paired with Ernie Els. Both players hit their tee shots into greenside bunkers, though on opposite sides of the hole. Maggart hit his sand shot first and holed out, drawing great applause and a bit of an uproar. As the cheering started to die down so Ernie could hit his bunker shot, a fan yelled out very clearly and loudly, "Same thing, Ernie." Needless to say, Ernie holed his bunker shot as well, and the fans went crazy. Fast forward to the tournament the following year. After spending the day spectating, my family, friends, and I went to P.F. Chang's. As I was walking out of the bathroom, who walks in? Ernie freaking Els. Story 36. I dated a girl for 2.5 years. Then we broke up. I was still in love with her but tried my best to give her space. About 10 months later, I was at a big show watching some friends' bands play. I was my usual mopey self that night, drinking and trying to have a good time. During the second-to-last band, my friends were headlining and I had planned to stay for their set. I got this ridiculous urge to leave. I can't explain why, I just knew I should go. I lived about a 30-minute walk from the club, but for some reason I felt like taking the 40-minute scenic route. I was about 10 minutes from home when my ex walked out of a restaurant with a mutual friend to get a cab. She said hi and was very friendly. She asked if I would walk her home, and of course I said yes. It turned out we had moved to about a block away from each other, which explained why I'd hear her voice outside my window every day. When we got to her door, she asked if I wanted to come in and meet her new cat. I hated cats at the time, but I went in anyway. Maybe she was trying to pick me up. Sure enough, we got back together. We're now married and just had our first baby last week. I still can't explain why I left the club that night. The band playing was fronted by a very attractive woman I could have hooked up with. I don't know how different my life would be if I hadn't had that urge to leave. Story 37. I was out with my friends. I had dropped off my girlfriend and was hanging out in one of my friend's rooms when I suddenly got a huge urge to take my car home. I knew I had to go, and it made me uncomfortable when I tried to brush it off. Realizing I had to leave, I told my friends I needed to bring my car home and would come back walking since his house wasn't too far. They were a little confused and told me to just stay, but I insisted. When I got in my car, I noticed my phone was on the passenger seat. It had been there the whole time. As soon as I sat down, it started ringing. It was my mother, urging me to bring the car home because she needed it for something. This was probably around 1:30 in the morning, when she's never up, let alone needing to drive. It was very strange. It felt almost like I was sensing her anxiety about needing the car from a remote location. Mother-son bond, I suppose. I am the son of a seventh son, after all. Story 38. Back in 1994, I picked up a CD with a bunch of old Infocom games. I was especially drawn to Planetfall since I had heard so much about it. For those who don't know, the game features a droid named Floyd who wanders around. When he enters a room, he says, "Floyd here now." Later that day, I logged into a MUD I was playing and shouted, "Floyd here now," just for fun. Almost immediately, people started messaging me, saying how excited they were and how great it was. I was utterly confused, until I realized that same week, maybe even the same day, Pink Floyd had released The Division Bell, their first new album in 7 years. Story 39. I left home to go to college and came back for a visit. I was telling my hometown friends about my new college boyfriend, Trevor, when one of my guy friends, Eric, suddenly says, "Wait," and runs to get his elementary school yearbook. There they were, Trevor and Eric, in the same class. Apparently, they had been best friends as kids until Eric moved away to the town where we now live. Eric and I had known each other throughout middle and high school, and then I ended up falling in love with Trevor, his childhood best friend. The best friends reunited part gets even weirder. My college best friend Cassie is good friends with Joe, who happens to be Eric's adoptive dad's new son-in-law through a second marriage. When everyone met for the first time, it was just strange realizing how connected we all already were. Story 40. Winter of 2009, I was at a friend's birthday party about 3 hours away. Her brother Anthony and his best friend Mark were there. Mark and I started talking and ended up having a long conversation about life. He told me he was madly in love with a girl, but she didn't feel the same way. They were best friends, but he was too afraid to tell her how he felt. I gave him a pep talk and encouraged him to go for it. Then we went our separate ways. A year later, shortly after a breakup, I messaged a cute girl I hadn't talked to in years. We had met through MySpace, had no mutual friends, and had only met once or twice in real life. We started chatting, hanging out, and eventually began dating. One day, I'm at her place, and guess who shows up? Mark. The girl I was now dating was the same girl he had been in love with a year earlier, the one I had told him to go for it with. What made it even stranger was that he was from a town 3 hours away. We didn't grow up in the same area, not even close. It gets weirder. My girlfriend and I have all these weird overlapping connections, despite growing up in separate cities and having no mutual friends. Her roommate and my ex went to the same high school about an hour away. One of my best friends dated her ex in high school 6 hours away. A guy who had been in love with her was bandmates with a close friend of mine. My favorite is that her best friend, born and raised in Louisiana, but now living in Texas with us, is friends with a girl I met on AIM in 2003 from Arizona, who I stayed in contact with. Basically, despite having no mutual friends and growing up in separate cities, my girlfriend's life and mine had overlapped countless times. Story 41. A year or so ago, I was riding somewhere with my roommate, playing with a bouncy ball. We stopped at a red light and I rolled down the window to bounce the ball on the ground outside. Being the idiot I am, I let it get away from me, and it flew off into traffic. I put on the saddest face I could muster. The guy in the truck next to us saw it, reached into the back of his truck, and pulled out a bag of literally hundreds of bouncy balls and poured them all through my window, right on top of me. Happiest day of my life. I was 22. I am not ashamed. Story 42. I'm from the UK and had booked a holiday to Florida last year with my girlfriend. We'd been a few years before and both really love it there. As a bit of backstory, my older brother had muscular dystrophy his whole life. He was a huge sci-fi and space fan, but because of his condition, he'd never been able to visit Kennedy Space Center. The day before we were due to fly out, my mom called to say he had been admitted to the hospital with a chest infection. Because he has difficulty coughing, it was done as a precaution. I asked if I needed to come up from Wales. She lives in Scotland, but she said the doctors assured her he was fine and there was nothing to worry about. I told her to tell him I would bring him home a piece of the space shuttle, a heat tile. So off to Florida we went. First day was at Disney, second day at Kennedy Space Center. Towards the end of the day, we went on the shuttle simulator. I was sitting next to a guy who was on his own, and we started chatting. He seemed nice. As we walked down the ramp looking at the stars, he turned to me and said, "There really is a God." Bit of an odd thing to say. We finished our Kennedy visit at the gift shop, where I bought the piece of space shuttle for my brother. Then we set off to Cocoa Beach, about a 30-minute drive. As soon as we stopped, my phone rang. It was my mum. My brother had passed away about 30 minutes earlier, aged 36. In his final moments, he kept mentioning clocks. Reset the clock, which was odd, because I had been looking at one of the countdown clocks in the gift shop, wondering whether to get him one of those too. My mum then asked if he remembered what I was getting him, the piece of the shuttle. Those were his final words. He died at nearly the exact moment I'd bought his gift. As an extra, I tried emailing Kennedy to see if they would let me scatter his ashes in the gardens, but they never responded. Later, I found out a friend went to school with an actual astronaut who is going up to the space station later this year. It's unlikely he would ever consider taking ashes, and I wouldn't ask, but it's a strange coincidence nonetheless. Story 43. When I was about 12, I was messing around with my uncle, a smart-ass guy who had just moved from Europe to the US. I liked teasing him because he had a fun, dry sense of humor. One day, I noticed he'd just bought a new book at Borders, about 1,000 pages, tiny print, and a brand new release. I came in and loudly proclaimed, "Did you know I can speed read?" He played along, saying, "No, of course not. Show me." So I picked up the book and skimmed through it obnoxiously fast. Not really reading anything, just fanning the pages in about 10 seconds. I then said, with the full intention of BS sefting, "Okay, now ask me a question." He thought for a moment and asked, "So when did Jane order at the bar?" Funnily enough, as I skimmed the book, only one phrase stood out in my mind, a single line on a random page, in the blink of an eye, Bloody Mary without ice. His jaw dropped. "Frigging what?" he exclaimed. I turned away and walked out of the room trying to play it cool, but inside I was ecstatic. Story 44. I was driving home from class one day and saw a friend standing on the side of the road with his dad. I pulled over to see what was going on. Apparently, he was showing his dad where he had totaled his car earlier that day. His dad had just picked him up from the hospital and he only had a scrape. Suddenly, another friend came flying over a hill, saw us, and slammed on his brakes. He lost control and skidded into my Jeep, which then hit my other friend standing next to it. Back to the hospital for him. Oh, and 6 months later, I rolled my Jeep not more than 100 yards from the same spot. Story 45. This all happened within 2 days. My sister had started dating a guy named Rob. One day she comes home and asks my mom if she knows a woman named insert name here. My mom gets a shocked look on her face. It turns out Rob's mother is someone my mom worked with almost 20 years ago. 2 days later, a separate but equally cool incident. I'm in my math class, talking to a cute girl about random stuff before class starts. She tells me she used to live in insert town here, and I laugh because that's where I used to live. Then she starts talking about her grandma, and I ask where she's from. Turns out it's the same area my grandpa is from. Her grandma has lived right down the block from my grandpa for years. It was seriously a hell of a week. Story 46. I lived in the same house for 8 years. My parents always wanted to move out of the trailer park, but they had turned that double wide into a very respectable home. One day, while driving around town, my mother said, if that house, pointing to a specific one across town, ever came up for sale, I would move there. Less than a week later, the house went on the market. My parents bid on it. Everything fell into place quickly, and we even got the down payment through my dad's GI loan. Within a month, we moved into our new house and sold our old double wide to a couple from a neighboring town. 2 weeks later, a tornado destroyed our old house. Tragically, the man who bought it was one of the 2 casualties, and they never recovered the house frame. We missed having a family of 4 in that house by just 2 weeks. Story 47. My dad grew up in Harrison, Ohio, but moved away when he was about 19 or 20 years before I was born. He had a best friend there, someone he did everything with, but they lost contact a few years after he moved. That friend came up in nearly every story my dad ever told about his childhood. Fast forward roughly 40 years. I was enlisted in the Marine Corps and went to the hospital for a routine checkup. The naval doctor attending me had the same last name as my dad's childhood friend. Curious, I asked where he had grown up. and lo and behold, he was the son of my dad's best friend. I gave him my dad's contact information, and after almost 40 years, they were able to reconnect. It was a strange, surreal coincidence. Story 48. I went to a conference in DC and happened to be near one of the premier speakers afterward. Usually it's hard to approach speakers. They're in a hurry and everyone wants their attention, but I caught up with him and said, "Hey, I'm not following you or anything. I just wanted to thank you for such an informative talk." He thanked me and said that was the best thing he'd heard all day, asked me a few questions, and then left. Later, when I got home and flipped on Netflix, I found a documentary on the same topic, and there he was as the main interviewee. I wasn't completely sure it was him, but he looked very much like the speaker I'd met. The next morning, I was taking the metro back from a meeting, far from both the area where he and I worked and the place where we'd been the night before. I saw him standing on the platform and recognized him only from the Netflix show. I walked up and said, "Hi, I just saw you on Netflix last night. Thanks for doing that show. It was really informative." It was only after I said it that I realized he was the same guy from the conference the night before. To make it worse, I almost got on his train with him just as he lifted his book in front of his face, clearly pretending to hide from the attention. It must have looked like I was following him. We somehow fell into almost the exact same conversation we'd had the previous night. I realized I'd said the same thing, and he'd responded the same way. Then it hit me. I had explicitly told him the night before not to think I was following him, and I was even wearing the same very distinct jacket. The weirdest part was that he wasn't getting on a train heading toward where he worked, and he was coming from a completely random direction. It wasn't somewhere you'd reasonably expect to run into the same person again. Still, it was clear he probably asks the same polite questions of everyone who recognizes him, which somehow made the whole thing even funnier and more awkward. Story 49. At the school lunch canteen on a hot day, I bought a Coke. There was a bottle top competition, win a free bottle if your cap had an imprinted removable plastic seal. I won, removed the seal, and claimed my prize. For a lark, I opened the second bottle, won again. I claimed that prize too. Just in case, I opened another bottle, won again. Opened one more, won again. By now, the lady at the counter was convinced I had forged the little plastic things, so she gave me 2 cans of Coke and a chocolate bar. I was frankly relieved. I gave my friends the cans and carried the rest up to my school bag to take home. This happened once again at school. I ended up with 3 bottles of Coke. The weird thing is, I never really drank Coke that often and rarely bought drinks. I was just weirdly lucky at school. Story 50. One night, my parents and I were leaving the theater and waiting in line to exit the parking deck. We saw a girl walking to her car, and my parents commented that she was pretty and had a nice outfit. She got into her car, a BMW X6, which had just come out at the time. It was the first time we had ever seen one, so we were all like, "Hey, that's a cool car." I just sat there staring at her car while we waited in line. The next night, I had to work as a hostess at a restaurant. That girl came in to have dinner, X6 and all. I didn't say anything, of course, but even though I'm a girl, I still felt a bit like a creeper. Story 51. In 2009, I decided to go backpacking along the coast of Australia and Southeast Asia. I had told quite a few friends back home in Canada about the adventure. I met a lot of people while I was in Australia, traveling alone, and left for Southeast Asia earlier than planned. One evening in Bangkok, I was on an IM service and noticed one of my college friends was online. I found it odd, since it was around 4 o'clock in the morning back home. She asked me how Australia was, and I told her I was actually in Bangkok. It turned out she was there too, on a layover. We met up for tea and shisha later that night. The next morning, I put my status as, "What a small world it really is." Within 20 minutes, I got a response from one of my Swedish friends I had met in Australia. "No kidding, I just saw you walking down Khao San Road in Bangkok." Later that night, a mutual friend came down, and we all went for dinner, talking about our plans for the coming months and how coincidental our meeting had been. It's a small world indeed. Story 52. I've got a couple of stories. First, my partner and I moved to Canada from Europe. About 10 years later, we went back across the pond for the first time. While in Paris, I was walking by the Centre Pompidou when I heard someone yell my name. I looked around but didn't see anyone familiar, shrugged it off, and forgot about it. 3 years later, I was back in Europe, staying with a childhood friend. We were talking about travel, and I mentioned my trip to Paris 3 years earlier. He said, "So I did see you near Centre Pompidou?" Second, while planning a trip to South America, I was talking to a friend from another city about meeting up for a weekend. We were trying to find a date that worked for both of us. I suggested a day, but it didn't work for him because of an upcoming trip. When I asked where, he said, also South America. It turned out we were on the same flight to the same final destination. Story 53. There was a girl I thought was hot from 4th to 6th grade, but she moved away at the start of middle school. I never knew where. Fast forward more than 10 years. It's my 21st birthday. I'm in college, far from where I grew up, celebrating at a local bar with some friends. My friends are chatting with a group of girls, and it turns out one of them is celebrating her 21st birthday too. They bring her over and introduce her. Yo, it's her birthday as well. Know what that means? Body shots. We look at each other, have a really awkward 10 seconds as we recognize one another, laugh, and then dive into body shots and making out. Never saw her again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.